Hello and welcome to this episode of Tallinn University Sports and Political Relations series on the 1936 Olympics through the perspective of race relations and critical race theory. Let's get into the episode. The precipice of the Second World War coincided with the meteoric rise of fascism across Europe, which was often marked by abject racial discrimination. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the 20th century's main character, the United States, was harboring a great deal of systemic racism of its own. Having risen to power in 1933, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party had already been handed down the right to host the 1936 Olympics. This was seen at the time as a great opportunity to allow Germany to reintegrate into the global community after its defeat in World War I. Though, as it would happen, Nazi Germany had no intention to integrate, and Hitler was even quoted in saying that the modern Olympics was a plot against the Aryan race by Freemasons and Jews. Eventually, however, Hitler would be swayed to the advice that the Games could be used as an invaluable propaganda opportunity to spread Aryan ideals. This intention would eventually manifest in the propaganda film Olympia, entrusted to filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl. As the Games edged closer, the global community began to take notice of racial discrimination taking place within Nazi Germany, with a notable expulsion of high-profile Jewish athletes from many of their sporting institutions. Avery Brundage, the then head of the American Olympic Committee, initially denounced Nazi Germany and was perceived to be in favor of boycotting the Games, stating that the very foundation of the modern Olympic revival will be undermined if individual countries are allowed to restrict participation by reason of class, creed, or race. American black-owned newspapers were quick to point out that it was hypocritical for American sports officials to demand equal treatment for German Jews when they tolerated and practiced discrimination against black athletes at home. We'll take a moment to overlay a theory developed by American academics in the 1970s and 1980s called critical race theory. Critical race theory was developed as a means of detecting the less overt instances of systemic racism that might exist within a society. Proponents of the theory often point to unequal access to public places, such as sporting clubs, as a mechanism of racism. A mechanism that was used in the United States as well as Nazi Germany, albeit with a great deal more subtlety in the former. The United States often didn't have a blanket ban on black participation in sporting clubs, instead preferring segregation with better access to facilities and coaching for white athletes. So, to reflect on Brundage's comments, we might generously suppose that the moral line in the sand is the strict restriction of participation, as distinct from other forms of racial discrimination present in the United States as outlined within the critical race theory. Avery Brundage would eventually visit Berlin in 1934 and report that Jews were being fairly treated and that the Games should proceed. And despite fervent opposition from Jewish communities and parts of the black community, Brundage led the United States to the Berlin Olympics. The Berlin Games would take place with 49 nations in attendance, which was an increase from 37 in the previous Games. We posit that it was pre-existing global prevalence of racial discrimination that made it difficult for the individual Olympic committees to commit to a boycotting of such a globally significant event. Germany would end the Games with the most medals. However, the success of Jesse Owens and his African-American track teammates with 12 gold medals between them would be a stain on the Nazis' Aryan propaganda, with some African-American athletes justifying their attendance with the purpose of, quote, beating the pants off their German competitors as a rejection of Nazi racial theory. In the aftermath of the Olympics, Brundage's integrity was further called into question by one of the two Jewish runners dropped from the American track team, Marty Glickman, who would speculate that Brundage may have influenced American coaches to remove Jewish athletes, possibly to avoid upsetting Hitler. If true, this would certainly throw further shade on Brundage's initial moral stance. Even beyond the borders of Nazi Germany, the world was significantly racially divided in the interwar era, and the international community's inability to boycott the Berlin Games can be seen as indicative of how blurry the international gauge of racial discrimination was. Without an absolute stance from the world's most influential state, the German Games were destined to proceed, and with compliments from the German propaganda machine, it would aid the Aryan narrative within German borders, with the final medal tally and Riefenstahl's images of Aryan dominance being displayed across the country.